In 1856, beneath the sprawling fields of sweet grass, where the heat hung heavy and the air bore the weight of cotton blossoms, an unseen world festered in shadows. Below the bustling surface of South Carolina plantations, the earth swallowed a network of cramped underground quarters, caverns of despair, carved by hands too weary to hold hope. These secret chambers, spaces not meant for living but for confinement, breathed a suffocating silence that bound the enslaved inside as tightly as the iron shackles that bit their flesh. The pressing darkness was a thick cloth, damp with earth's cold embrace, muffling the whispered prayers, the muffled sobs, and the faint scratching sounds of desperate hands clawing against raw wood and stone. This silence was not merely absence of sound, it was survival's thin veil, a warning etched deep into every bone and breath within those buried walls. What stirred beneath the sweetgrass fields was terror lived day by day, an ancient grinding terror muted by the humid South Carolina air above. What voices inhabited these dungeons fashioned from wrought and iron? What stories have time's hands deliberately covered with dust? The ledger leaves gaps, but accounts suggest that these quarters were not just prisons, they were crucibles of endurance, where soul and body waged quiet wars against invisibility and oblivion. A faint, persistent scratching breaks the stillness, a clawing, not merely against wood, but against the very limits of captivity. Could it be an act of defiance, or the frantic tapping of a heartbeat begging to be heard? Such a small sound in this subterranean graveyard becomes a signal, a crack in the fractured facade of silence. Who dares disturb what must remain hidden? And what price will be paid when the earth itself reveals the secrets it has long buried? The air is thick with the scent of damp soil and rotting leaves mixed with the acrid tang of sweat and lamp oil, each breath a bitter reminder of close quarters and crowded misery. The hard-packed dirt floors press unyielding against bare feet. The rough-hewn wooden boards scrape coarse textures against skin. Breath catches in the throat, lungs tight, as if the very atmosphere conspires to choke resilience. In this claustrophobic underworld, every sound, a scrape of cloth, a low murmur, the faint rustle of shifting bodies, carries a weight of fear and fragile hope. Would you recognize those who lived here by the way their hands clutched the rough timbers or trembled against the cold iron of their restraints? Their gazes, if ever lifted, would meet only shadows cast by flickering candles above. The silence teaches caution. Even a cough could be a death sentence. Here, human life is a fragile thread woven through a labyrinth of hardship and despair, agonizingly close to unraveling completely. Records imply that such underground quarters were illegal to map, kept off ledgers and from the eyes of visitors. Their secrecy was a fortress built of fear and cruelty, where enslaved people were neither seen nor heard, a deliberate erasure beneath the veneer of plantation prosperity. The quarters were often carved into earth, alongside slave markets, or hidden near rice fields, where watchful overseers scarcely glanced. The confines were so tight that the air turned stagnant, dampness seeping through walls like a silent, unyielding oppressor. Whispers of attempts to communicate between these hidden cells tell of an unbroken human spirit, even when oppression sought to quash it with iron and fire. In the dim light of dawn, the underground quarters of South Carolina's plantations revealed their daily truths, cramped wooden walls that pressed close like an unyielding grip, the rough texture of splintered boards scraping against bare skin. Inside these suffocating confines, the air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, damp earth, and the faint, acrid trace of burning pine resin used to ward off biting insects. The enslaved awoke to a grim routine signaled not by birdsong, but by the distant clatter of tools and the sharp bark of overseers from above, sounds swallowed quickly by the heavy soil, but felt deeply within these hollowed spaces. The quarters offered scant refuge. Floors were hard-packed dirt, cold and uneven, through which roots twisted like silent serpents. Few possessions adorned the living spaces, tattered scraps of cloth, worn wooden implements fashioned from stolen moments of labor, and the barest of comforts, a threadbare blanket or a straw mattress crushed beneath too many bodies squeezed together for survival. The slave's hands, calloused and trembling, knew every rough surface as an extension of their own suffering and resilience. Their sleep was measured in stolen fragments, breaks punctuated by the low moans and restless shifts of those who bore the brunt of relentless toil and despair. Workdays stretched into merciless hours under the unforgiving southern sun. Plantation life enforced a relentless task system, where enslaved laborers had demands that went beyond the fields, repairing fences, pounding rice grains, tending livestock, or maintaining the intricate machinery of plantation houses. Yet beneath this grind, they nurtured a fragile economy of their own, bartering goods secretly made or found, simple treats like oysters, cloth scraps, and homemade cakes exchanged in brief moments of communal reprieve. These small acts of autonomy kindled flickers of self-worth in lives otherwise defined by deprivation. Would you grasp the quiet rebellion contained in a freshly sewn garment or a carefully cultivated patch of corn? Such acts were as much assertions of personhood as defiance, delicate threads woven tightly against erasure. Yet even these small freedoms were shadowed by laws that tightened their grip like unforgiving iron. South Carolina's slave codes dictated ruthless punishments, lashes for straying without permission, the brutal vigilance of slave patrols, and the constant threat of separation from family. The particulars of compliance were monitored with cold precision. Slaves were forbidden from assembling, marrying officially, or learning to read, restrictions designed to fracture solidarity and smother hope. The daily rhythms shaped the enslaved body and mind indelibly. Children as young as 4 were pressed into the task of childminders, watching siblings while mothers labored. Mothers themselves bore unspeakable burdens, encouraged to bear many children, their offspring regarded chiefly as property of the plantation master. The tightly packed quarters echoed with the muffled cries of infants, the whispered lamentations of mothers who dared only imagine an escape beyond the walls of market and field. Every breath taken in confidence or fear entered the ledger of survival. In moments stolen from exhaustion, laughter and song flickered like fragile flames, a fleeting but vital spark of humanity. Stories passed like ripples, weaving oral histories into a shared tapestry of endurance and resistance, precious secrets folded within gospel hymns and coded work songs. Yet even here in these spaces of communal survival, the overseer's shadow loomed. Each whispered plan, furtive gathering, risked discovery and swift, merciless retribution. The rustle of worn cloth, the scratch of needle on fabric, the creak of a door opening, all became signals in a silent language of resilience and fear. Beneath the surface of daily task and tally, the enslaved nurtured dreams that crept like vines through the cramped quarters, dreams of freedom, of life unbound by the whip or shackles. But with freedom came danger, each decision weighted by the knowledge that the cost of escape or defiance might be death or worse. As the sun rose higher, filtering light that never quite reached into the earth's hidden wombs, the story expands into the hands that mended, the backs that bent, and the hearts that refused to break. The rope that tied limbs also tied souls together in a binding unity, a hope that whispered beneath the sweat and smoke. Would you, trapped in such darkness and despair, find the strength to endure or the courage to resist? In these quarters beneath the sweet grass, both endurance and resistance coiled tightly, waiting to unravel. The rope, twisted and worn, was more than a mere tool in the underground slave quarters of South Carolina. It was the embodiment of an unyielding system of control, a tangible symbol of bondage and terror. In 1856, under the iron fist of South Carolina's slave codes, the rope became a cruel arbiter, wielded not merely to contain bodies, but to fracture spirits. The laws of the time codified punishment with brutal precision. First offenses of running away were marked by lashes, as many as 40 strikes that tore flesh and scarred flesh, like the rope's rough fibers that caressed skin. Subsequent transgressions escalated the injury, branding with a scorching iron, the cutting off of an ear, even castration, marking the body as public property and warning others through marks carved in flesh. Within the quarters, the weight of these punishments hung as palpably as the thick humidity. The rough texture of rope against skin was a memory and a warning, whispered between the tight walls lined with rough timber and clay. Accounts suggest that overseers frequently employed the rope as a binding agent, not only physically, but psychologically chaining the enslaved to a perpetual state of fear. It wrapped around wrists and ankles, a coiling threat reminding every individual of their fragile place in the plantation's rigid hierarchy. The rope was a silent jury that tightened with every act of resistance, every fleeting hope of freedom. Yet even as the rope symbolized oppression, it also held a paradoxical power. Some enslaved individuals learned to manipulate its presence, whispering of ropes, secretly knotted in hidden pockets, tools not only of subjugation, but symbols of escape and rebellion. Would you dare to clutch such a dangerous lifeline, knowing it could be both your shackle and your salvation? In the damp stillness of the quarters, soaked with the sickly sweet scent of sweat and pine resin, the rope became a silent storyteller of wills, clashing beneath the surface, each fiber a fragile link in a chain of survival and defiance. Records imply that the rope and other implements of punishment were not just remnants of cruelty, but instruments of enforcement, codified by laws aimed at stamping out hope. South Carolina's slave laws forbade any slave to leave their owner's property without written permission, and any found off-premises without such a pass could be whipped by any white person encountered. This omnipresent threat hung like a noose invisible to the eye, yet suffocating in its hold. The code allowed for public displays of punishment intended as spectacles of warning, a brutal theater where the rope was the lead actor, cutting through flesh and will with impartial severity. Inside these quarters, where the air was heavy with the damp sting of mold and the metallic chill of iron, the rope left marks not only on bodies, but on minds. Each lash echoed long after its blow, tightening the psychological bonds that sought to break the enslaved spirit. Against this oppressive weight, the rope was a cruel metronome, keeping time to a punishment rehearsed daily, a dark rhythm mirrored in the grinding toil above and the silent prayers below. The rope's presence was a constant reminder. Freedom was measured not only by chains broken, but by the scars that remained hidden beneath skin. As the sun dipped beyond the horizon, casting long shadows into corners where whispers of rebellion flickered like faint candlelight, the rope coiled silently within reach, both a tool of oppression and a fragile beacon of fragile hope. Could it be that the same rope tightening around wrists might one day bind the chains of captivity and fray the edifice of cruelty itself? Beneath the earth's surface, in the cold clasp of dark quarters, the rope remained an enduring symbol of fate, a line drawn taut between despair and the fierce longing for freedom. South Carolina in 1856 was gripped by a legal ironclad designed to smother every spark of autonomy among the enslaved. The slave codes, framed over decades and morphed through brutal revisions, stood as a grim testament to a society that sought to control not just bodies, but the very will to resist. The laws demanded absolute subjugation. No slave could leave their owner's property without a written pass or be found traveling alone at night without permission. Any breach triggered swift and severe punishment, often administered by any white person who encountered the offender. The very notion of movement beyond the plantation was criminalized, transforming simple acts of walking into dangerous acts of rebellion. The physical punishments were merciless and meticulously graduated. A first offense for running away usually invited whipping, not spares, but up to 40 lashes, with a heavy leather whip or rawhide that left streaked flesh and lasting wounds. The pain was language, spoken not in words but in welts. For a second offense, the law imposed branding, typically an R seared into the right cheek, a grotesque sign meant to mark a slave for life as runaway. The third offense could cost one ear, severed as a gruesome reminder to others who might contemplate escape. The fourth offense, reserved for men, was castration, a brutal severing of manhood, aimed not only at punishment, but the destruction of future generations of resistance. Women faced their own horrors, repeated whipping, branding on the cheek, and ear cropping. The law even envisaged a fifth offense, leaving discretion to local justices to order mayhem, so severe it could include cutting the Achilles tendon or death itself. Within the underground quarters, these laws were more than words. They were a creeping terror, lodged deep in muscle memory and whispered in fearful murmurs. The rope that bound bodies was invested with the dread of these statutes, a physical extension of the code's cruelty. Would you remain silent under such laws? The codes forbade teaching slaves to read or write, forbade gathering, owning property, or marrying legally. The law made clear that enslaved people were property, denied basic human rights, and strictly controlled through surveillance and violence. Slave patrols, a terrorizing white militia, routinely searched homes and public spaces, empowered to mete out whipping on the spot for suspected disobedience without trial. These patrols, operating mostly at night and on Sundays, created a landscape saturated with constant fear and suspicion, aiming to prevent any flicker of organized rebellion or escape. The quarters, damp and cramped, hosted these specters of oppression. The heavy stench of sweat mingled with earth and iron. Wooden beams bore the scars of rope and lash. Every creak and groan whispered the echoes of violence. Every act of defiance was met with disproportionate cruelty, legally sanctioned and brutally real. The law's reach was pervasive, extending even into the treatment of the enslaved by their owners, threatening fines for failure to punish according to code. This legal architecture ensured that violence was not accidental but systemic, a mechanism of racial terror engineered to preserve an economic and social order built on enslavement. The binding rope and the arc of the lash were then more than instruments. They were enshrined in the legal framework as unavoidable punishments. They were daily reminders that beneath the surface of plantation gentility lay a machinery of law and brutality. These laws were not static relics. They shifted as fears deepened, a reaction to revolts like Nat Turner's, legislation tightening like a noose after every act of resistance. Beneath this legal darkness, the enslaved endured, their resilience a quiet challenge to laws designed to break them. As night fell over the plantations, the sharp creak of a rope pulled taut or the distant crack of a lash echoed not only a physical punishment, but the chilling persistence of control. The question remains, whispered beneath layers of history and dust, how much will was truly crushed beneath these codes, and how much silently endured, waiting for the fragile moment of rupture. Voices echo through the dark corridors of history, recounting the merciless enforcement of South Carolina's slave codes in 1856. Laws crafted to cleave bodies and spirit alike. These statutes transformed punishment into a spectacle of control, imposing restraints so severe they shaped lives beneath the surface of palpable terror. The whip, always close at hand, cracked the still air, its leather lash tearing flesh in public scenes meant to deter any flicker of resistance. The legal script was harsh and unyielding. First-time runaways faced up to 40 lashes, a brutal tally marked in crimson lines across backs and shoulders. Repeat offenders were branded with a scorching iron, the letter R seared into a cheek, a cruel badge of shame designed to brand them as fugitives permanently. Records imply that third offenses could cost an ear, cut off as a terrifying reminder to the community. Male slaves who fled a fourth time risked castration, a savage mutilation aimed to extinguish their manhood and hope. Female slaves were not spared. Their punishments included repeated whipping, branding, and deafening mutilation, a physical silencing of defiance. The patrols, patrolling under moonlight and noonday sun alike, were steeled with statutory authority to enforce these codes with arbitrary cruelty. Overseers and white citizens alike wielded legal permission to inflict punishments on the spot. Would you dare to risk a single misstep under such omnipresent surveillance? The air in the quarters, heavy with the musk of sweat and earth, thickened with dread as the shadow of these patrols passed, a reminder that at any moment the rope might tighten, the lash crack, or silence descend through violence. The code extended beyond punishments, constraining simple freedoms. Slaves were forbidden from owning property, working for wages, planting crops, or wearing anything but coarse Negro cloth. Education was outlawed with ferocity. Teaching slaves to read or write brought heavy fines and imprisonment for white transgressors. Even religious meetings were curtailed to prevent gatherings that might spur rebellion. These laws rendered the enslaved not merely prisoners of flesh, but captives of a brutal social system that sought to erase knowledge and kinship alongside freedom. Inside the cramped quarters, the consequences of these codes were immediate and raw. The scraping sound of chains and the sharp sting of the whip left invisible marks etched deep in memory. The rope's rough heft was as familiar as the dirt floor beneath trembling feet, intertwining physical pain with psychological bondage. Whispers amongst the enslaved spoke of the rope's dual nature, instrument of suffering yet symbol of tenuous hope, a lifeline to freedom in furtive acts of resistance. History does not offer easy answers, but leaves us with haunting questions. How did such cruel laws shape the souls they sought to break? Could hope survive under the weight of brands seared into flesh and futures cruelly severed? As the shadows lengthened over the plantations, the law's iron grip was evident in every shackle, lash, and burned mark. Yet beneath these marks, stories of enduring spirit pulsed quietly, stubborn as the sweet grass growing above the hidden quarters, waiting for a moment to rise. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion casts a long, ominous shadow over the enslaved quarters of South Carolina, though the uprising itself took place a quarter-century earlier, in 1831 Virginia. The reverberations of that fierce insurrection trembled through the plantations of the South, including those deep beneath the sweetgrass fields, where the echoes of rebellion mingled with the scent of sweat and fear. Turner, an enslaved preacher who believed he was chosen by divine will, orchestrated a revolt that erupted into violent upheaval over 2 days. His band of rebels marched from plantation to plantation, armed with knives, hatchets, and crude weapons, leaving a trail of terror among white inhabitants. Turner's rebellion was marked by its swift brutality. Between 55 and 60 white people were killed, many in their sleep. The uprising was not a random act of violence, but a desperate struggle for liberation, a cry ripped from the throats of the oppressed. Yet the response was merciless. White militias crushed the insurrection with overwhelming force, executing around 54 of the captured rebels. More brutal still, white mobs hunted down other African Americans, many innocent, in retaliation, slaughtering hundreds as a grim warning. This wave of violence did not cleanse the stain of oppression, but deepened the terror, tightening the chokehold of law and surveillance. This rebellion haunted white slaveholders who lived in constant dread beneath the surface of plantation life. The aftermath unleashed a tidal wave of new laws across the South, laws that further stripped freedom and hope from the enslaved. Religious gatherings were regulated or banned unless overseen, reading and writing forbidden under harsh penalties. State legislatures entrenched restrictions even more deeply, placing white ministers in charge of slave worship to stifle dissent and tracking every movement with patrols empowered to punish without trial. Would you imagine living in quarters where fear was not just of physical lashings but the invisible chains wrought by law? In the cramped, dark slave quarters, where the thick air clung to skin like wet cloth, the trauma of rebellion and repression interwove in every whispered story and circumspect glance. The enslaved knew the fine line between survival and death was enforced not only by overseers with whips, but by codes that legitimized terror and cruelty. The underground was more than a physical place of confinement. It was a crucible of psychological captivity, shaped by the recoiling threats of revolts past and punishments present. Against this backdrop, Turner's rebellion was still fertile ground for whispered hope and palpable dread. It was a reminder that even beneath the brutal law and the constricting earth, the spirit of resistance pulsed. The legacy of that night in 1831 led to harsher surveillance, but it never extinguished the flame of defiance. The roar of that rebellion echoed in silent footsteps, furtive glances, and the tightening grasp on ropes, some binding, some tied in secret savings of courage. These whispered legacies wove their way through the quarters, questions lingering like the fading smoke of a hidden fire. How long must chains bind before they break? And who will hold the rope when they do? The flicker of a distant firelight recalls the fury that ignited in the underground quarters' shadowed history, a flame born from desperation and defiance. The rebellion, inflamed by whispered tales of Nat Turner's revolt, surged through the clandestine veins of South Carolina's enslaved communities. Turner's bold uprising in Virginia during 1831 shattered illusions of docility among enslavers, sending shockwaves far beyond the borders of Southampton County. Though it had been 25 years since that night of blood and judgment, its ghost lingered in every cramped corner, in every whispered prayer beneath the earth. Nat Turner was more than a man. He was a symbol of divine wrath and human resistance intertwined. A preacher by conviction and an insurgent by necessity, Turner believed himself chosen to dismantle the monstrous system that enslaved him and his people. His rebellion, though brutally quashed within days, ignited an inferno of white panic that cascaded through the South. Militias slaughtered not only captured conspirators, but hundreds more innocents whose only crime was their color. The laws grew colder and tighter, weaving a net of iron around hope, outlawing literacy, assembly, and worship without white oversight. Within the underground quarters of South Carolina, this fear was palpable. The scent of damp earth, mixed with the acrid stench of sweat and smoke, filling lungs laboring under the weight of oppression and terror. Every rustling leaf above concealed silent watchers, slave patrols armed with whips and muskets, ready to strike at the merest hint of unrest. Would you dare sing a song, pass a word of rebellion, or clutch a threadbare rope that could either free you or tighten your bonds? The stakes were not simply freedom or capture, they were life or death. The past myth of a contented slave was shattered. The quarters echoed with stories of flight, rebellion, and retribution. These subterranean spaces witnessed more than survival. They bore witness to fragile sparks of hope flickering against the suffocating void. Turner's rebellion had not been an isolated burst of violence, but a beacon that swung through the mindscape of the enslaved. Efforts to suppress these memories faced fierce resistance. Despite laws that forbade congregation and preaching without white supervision, secret worship persisted, a sanctuary where faith and rebellion intertwined. The underground breathes these moments, silent prayers woven into the fabric of survival, songs cloaked in coded meanings, and shared glances promising that resistance, however dangerous, endured. The consequence was a tightening web, more patrols, harsher laws, and brutal reprisals intended to snuff out defiance before it could breathe. Yet beneath heavy soil and under heavy watch, the human spirit threaded through the rope's fibers. The same ropes that bound bodies were sometimes coiled for escape or clandestine signaling. The lingering question, whispered like smoke escaping brittle walls, is whether the chains forged to suppress could also be unraveled by the will to endure. History hands down no certainties, only the flickering flame of hope that one day, beneath the sweet grass and soil, the ropes of captivity might finally loosen their grasp. Captured voices rise from the depths of history, accounts of a preacher turned insurgent, whispered with reverence and fear. Nat Turner's rebellion shook the foundations of the slaveholding South, reverberating far beyond Virginia's borders into the very heart of South Carolina's plantations. This violent uprising became a catalyst for tightening the oppressive frameworks that governed enslaved lives. In its aftermath, South Carolina groaned beneath heavier chains, its slave codes sharpened and ruthlessly enforced to extinguish the ember of rebellion. Turner's legacy was a double-edged sword, inspiring hope beneath the sweetgrass, while justifying cruel repression above. The state legislature answered the reverberations of revolt with laws stripping away freedoms more harshly than before. The banning of education among enslaved people aimed to sever the transmission of knowledge and hope. Religious worship became a tightly controlled spectacle, limited to overseen gatherings where white ministers stamped out rebellious teachings, cloaked in sermons. Afraid of any spark that might kindle defiance, South Carolinians outlawed reading, writing, assembly, and even singing without strict supervision. The slave patrols, empowered by law, multiplied their midnight rides and daylight inspections with a newfound zeal. Patrolmen, armed with whips and muskets, became the ever-watchful eyes policing enslaved bodies and behaviors. The code decreed full authority to punish on the spot, foregoing due process, terrifying any who dared bend the rules. Enslaved people lived under a state of constant shadow and suspicion, where a whispered word or secret meeting could lead to brutal lashings, imprisonment, or worse. Yet, Beneath this tightening grip, aspects of clandestine resistance lived on. The quarters breathed with hidden prayers and coded songs, moments where faith intertwined with defiance. The rope, harsh and unforgiving in punishment, was sometimes secretly knotted for escape or signaling, an emblem of resilience twisted within the harsh rules of captivity. Would you hold on to hope in such crushing space? Could light live in darkness so thick it nearly suffocated breath itself? The laws and punishments surrounding this period were not only legal machinery, but cultural weapons designed to dehumanize and isolate. South Carolina's post-Turner legal landscape forged a world where every gesture, every breath, was policed and controlled by fear and regulation. This legacy cast long shadows beneath the sweetgrass fields, where the ropes and shackles left marks not just on bodies, but deep inside the spirit, setting the stage for a reckoning that would echo through generations. Captured in the stark lines of archival testimony, the interrogation rooms of South Carolina's plantations were where the raw machinery of oppression revealed its merciless face. Here, beneath the veneer of genteel plantation life, the overlords wielded control with ruthless precision. Enslaved rebels, captured and broken, faced a grim crucible of questioning, each breath tight with fear, every gesture scrutinized beneath cold, unyielding gazes. These rooms were liminal spaces where bodies were not just held, but dissected for secrets, where the tremble of a hand or the downward cast of eyes could mark a fate sealed by iron law. The overseers and interrogators embodied institutional brutality, voices void of mercy, words clipped and loaded with threat. Questions were designed not to seek truth, but to crush resistance, to expose networks of rebellion and shatter hope of escape. The texture of leather straps and coarse rope punctuated the air, tangible reminders of punishment looming close. The low creak of shackles punctuated the silence between accusations, underscoring the stark perimeter fenced by fear. An enslaved person's breath, shallow and ragged, carried the weight of despair and defiance with equal intensity, an unvoiced plea woven between the demands for information. Records imply that torture lurked just beyond legal boundaries. Whippings, withholding food and water, and sleep deprivation were tools wielded to erode resistance, blurring the line between justice and cruelty. The overseer's cold calculus weighed the prisoner's resolve against the necessity of subjugation. As the interrogations rippled through the quarters, their effects radiated beyond immediate victims, instilling dread in the wider enslaved community. The very act of questioning became an instrument of terror, reinforcing a regime where silence was survival, and words could become weapons wielded by captors. Would you witness the slow unraveling of someone who dared resist, felt the shift from human to property under the harsh gaze of the law? The rooms echoed with fractured confessions and silent refusals, their psychological landscape as jagged as the iron that bound wrists. The stark light, flickering from oil lamps, cast elongated shadows over faces drawn tight with pain and resolve, making every whispered name a dangerous utterance. The quarters thrummed with the tension between broken bodies and unyielding spirits, a silent battlefield where freedom was wrested inch by inch, and every word could decide life or death. As the days folded one into another, the interrogation became more than a ritual of punishment. It was a reckoning beneath the earth, where hope flickered against the cold weight of oppression. Amidst the quiet torment, the rope waited, both a tool of binding and a symbol of reluctant endurance. In those moments of confrontation, the underground held its breath, poised between silence and the shattered echoes of rebellion yet to come. In the wildfire aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, an upheaval far beyond the initial revolt swept across the slave-holding South, sending ripples into the plantations and underground quarters of South Carolina. Though Turner's uprising had been brutally crushed in 1831 Virginia, its impact was felt deeply in the law and psyche of the region. White panic spiraled into indiscriminate violence as militias and mobs hunted down suspected accomplices, or merely those who happened to be black. Estimates suggest that hundreds of African Americans were killed in retaliatory strikes, many innocent and unrelated, their lives extinguished in waves of racial terror. South Carolina's response to this fear was swift and severe, embedding itself into the legal fabric with new slave codes that tightened control as never before. The legislature enacted laws designed to muzzle communication and prevent insurrection through crippling social restrictions. Reading, writing, and religious gatherings were harshly curtailed, if not outright banned, unless white ministers supervised. White patrols multiplied and extended their reach, empowered to punish harshly without the due process of law, a vigilant surveillance that turned every step and whisper into potential rebellion. These codes wrought more than fear. They redefined daily existence in the slave quarters. The spaces beneath the sweetgrass fields became not only sites of suffocation, but crucibles where the tensions of resistance and repression were most intimately felt. Families were torn apart by forced sales and punishment. Secret meetings dissolved under threat of brutal reprisal. The rhythmic crack of the lash and the coarse pull of rope became both instruments of terror and reluctant symbols of resilience. In these cramped quarters, the rebels' defiance became etched not only in scars, but in stories passed silently, like sacred wounds. Efforts to educate and organize in secret fueled fear in the oppressors, but glimmers of hope in the oppressed. Would you risk these forbidden acts in spaces where discovery meant death or worse? The underground held countless acts of quiet bravery, coded prayers, hushed planning, the groundwork for resistance that law could never entirely destroy. Echoes of Nat Turner's revolt resonated in every tightened chain, every surveillance patrol, every law that sought to erase voice and vision. The aftermath was not only a renewed symphony of control, but a testament to endurance. Though the whip fell harder and surveillance darkened, the spirit beneath the sweetgrass struggled still, waiting in the shadows for the moment when silence could finally shatter and freedom seize the air. The marked faces of the executed rebels, their fates sealed beneath the cold justice of South Carolina's courts, cast long shadows in the memory of the enslaved quarters. Nat Turner's rebellion, though sparked in Virginia, ignited a terror that spread through the South like wildfire, hitting South Carolina's plantations with legal and violent reprisals of merciless scope. Dozens of alleged conspirators were seized, their trials swift and brutal, many ending with the rope's unforgiving embrace or the hangman's noose. This wave of repression sent a clear message, not only to the enslaved but to any who dared dream of freedom. The state's white militias, patrols, and vigilantes extended their sway, hunting perceived threats with zealous brutality. Rumors of conspiracies sparked widespread panic, and mobs enacted violent retribution on many African Americans unaffiliated with any revolt. In some counties, hundreds were killed during this frenzy, the quiet of plantations shattered by cries and gunfire. The law, ostensibly a safeguard, became an instrument of terror. Legal proceedings frequently were overshadowed by extrajudicial killings, and captains of patrols wielded unchecked power. This storm of repression reshaped daily existence for many enslaved people. The loss of community leaders and kin, whether through sale, execution, or intimidation, left fractures within already tenuous bonds. Listening carefully above the rustle of leaves and distant calls for order, one would hear whispered stories of loss, survival, and resilience, told through broken voices and furtive gatherings beneath the earth. Yet these stories, though scattered and subdued, became seeds of future resistance, a testimony that even in crushing despair, hope can root itself deeply. Would you hold hope in a world where the law tightens its grip with every act of defiance? South Carolina's legislature codified harsher laws, further restricting the movements, education, and worship of enslaved people. White ministers were mandated to oversee religious services, strangling the spiritual sanctuary that had been a refuge. Laws forbade teaching slaves to read or write, fearing that knowledge might kindle another flame of insurrection. These restrictions created layers of control, weaving a tighter net that encompassed plantations, underground quarters, and the hearts beating within them. Yet, beneath the surface of legal oppression and brutal enforcement, human spirit persevered. The quarters beneath the sweetgrass, though dim and stifling, pulsed with quiet acts of rebellion and survival. The rope that bound bodies was also a thread linking hope, endurance, and the unyielding desire for freedom. The rebellion's aftermath carved scars both visible and hidden, marking a world where oppression sought to silence but could never wholly erase the yearning to break free. The story of memory and history beneath the sweetgrass intertwines both oral traditions and archival silences, each fragment a vital thread in the tapestry of a suppressed past. South Carolina's slave quarters, like those across the South, housed not only bodies but stories, oral histories passed in whispered gatherings, songs folded in coded layers, testimonies handed down against erasure. These voices often conflict with official records, documents whose ink was stained with omission, bias, and deliberate concealment. The archive is a battleground where legend and fact struggle for dominance, creating a fractured narrative of suffering, resistance, and resilience. Oral histories speak of secret meetings held beneath the earth, moments when prayers murmured in defiance, intertwined with plans whispered by flickering candlelight, songs encoded with messages of escape, and warning threaded through the quarters, carrying hope on wings too fragile to be silenced. The elders, who held memory like sacred trust, recounted tales of kindness and cruelty, of family torn and remade under plantations' brutal regimes. These stories among the enslaved were acts of survival, a cultural resistance to histories that sought to mute their existence. Yet plantation records and state archives paint a colder picture. They catalog punishments in clinical detail, but erase names and voices, turning humans into property slips and transaction ledgers. Laws codify violence and restrict freedoms, yet are silent on the humanity that endured beneath them. The inconsistencies between oral and written histories highlight the deliberate silencing of dissenting truths. Would you trust a ledger that credits punishment over pain, property values over lives? This tension between the spoken and the recorded history invites us to question what is preserved, what is lost, and who decides the story told. Seasonal rhythms and weather patterns imprinted themselves on the lives lived in these quarters. The oppressive humidity of South Carolina summers pressed heavy on skin, mingling with the scent of broken earth after storms and the faint aroma of wild sweetgrass. Winter nights brought chilling drafts that crept like fingers through boards, while the lengthening daylight in spring mingled with the longing for freedom's first breath. Each season marked cycles of labor and suffering, endurance and respite, embedding the natural world in the emotional landscape of captivity. Navigating this layered archive demands respect for complexity and contradiction. The interplay between legend and fact, the tangible and intangible, reveals histories hidden beneath the surface, urging a reckoning with memory as much as law. Beneath the sweetgrass and soil, the unfinished stories pulse, reminding us that history is not only written by victors but lived in the shadows by those who dared to endure.